Thank you for joining. This is Michelle Savage with XBRL US, and you're here for the XBRL US webinar, the SEC notice on the IFRS Taxonomy, what it means for foreign private issuers, XBRL providers, and data users. Before we get started, just a couple of logistical points. If you have any problems during the course of the presentation and you need technical support, please email us at support, S-U-P-P-O-R-T, @xbrl.us, and we'll do our best to get you back and online. As we go through the presentation, feel free to send us questions by clicking on the Q&A link at the top of your screen. You can just key the questions in there, and then we'll take them as they come in. Everyone on the call is muted except for the presenters. And finally, we are offering CPE credit for the session today. So for those of you accepting CPE credit, we'll be asking a couple of questions, and make sure that you respond to those questions so that we get our certificates out to you on time. Okay, so with that, I'm going to introduce our speakers. We're very happy to have with us today Jill Davis. Jill is the Associate Chief Accountant in the Division of Corporation Finance, in the Office of the Chief Accountant at the Securities and Exchange Commission. We also have Kimberly Earle, Associate Chief Accountant, Division of Economic and Risk Analysis in the Office of Structured Disclosure at the SEC, and Walter Hampshire, Senior IT Program Manager, Office of Structured Disclosure at the SEC. We also have Campbell Pride, President and CEO of XBRL US, and Andy Wood, Senior Technical Manager of the IFRS Taxonomy at the International Accounting Standards Board. Before we get started, I want to turn to Kimberly Earle with the SEC, who has a couple of points that she'd like to make.
Thank you, Michelle. Just to read the SEC standard disclaimer, the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission, as a matter of policy, disclaims responsibility for any private publication or statement by any of its employees. The views expressed herein are those of the author and do not necessarily reflect the views of the Commission or of the author's colleagues upon the staff of the Commission.
Thanks very much, Kimberly. Andy, I think that you have a similar statement you'd like to read from the IASB.
Hello, yes, I do. It's quite short, thankfully. The views expressed in this presentation are those of the presenter, not necessarily those of the International Accounting Standards Board, the Board, or the IFRS Foundation.
Great, thanks very much. Okay, with that, I'm going to walk through the agenda. First, we're going to cover questions on the rule and on the taxonomy. Then we'll take a couple of CPE questions. Then we'll move on to questions about tagging and validation and the Edgar Filer Manual. We'll have a couple of additional CPE questions and then open up to additional Q&A. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Campbell Pride, who's going to lead us through the Q&A session.
Thank you, Michelle. And thank you everyone for joining us today. This is the second webinar we are holding on the SEC's notice on the availability of the IFRS Taxonomy. There were a lot of questions on our last webinar, so we felt it was important to continue addressing questions raised by issuers and vendors, and anyone who's going to be working with the taxonomy and going to be working to file any FPIs who are going to be filing in the United States. Just to reiterate for those of you who may not have been on the call, the SEC has given notice that foreign private issuers may begin immediately to submit their financial statements in an XBRL format, or at the latest for fiscal periods ending on or after December 15th, 2017. And just to reiterate again, this is covered by in 2009 when the SEC published the rule related to XBRL filing originally. Foreign private issuers were included in that rule, but at the time they haven't had to file until now because of the availability of the IFRS taxonomy. So now all foreign private issuers must file their XBRL document at the same time they file their traditional HTML document. And so today we'll go through and hopefully clarify any questions that folks have had on this, reiterate some of the questions that were raised and last time. So just to start it off, just a question to some questions on the rule, and this is probably Kimberly or Jill, you probably answer this, is do you have to file your XBRL financials on the same day that you file your Form 20F?
Hi, Campbell. The answer to that question is that the original rule provides for a 30-day grace period for the initial filing of XBRL, the first time that a company ever files XBRL with the Commission. There is a 30-day grace period, and that's required to be detail tagged. Any subsequent filings that require XBRL, it's provided on the same day as the HTML filing.
Great, thank you. The next question that someone had asked, and this is a very specific question, but are there any unique rule differences between the US and the IFRS filings, such as the length of element names acceptable by the SEC?
Campbell, I won't get into any detailed specifics on unique rule differences in this webinar, but regarding the question about the length of element names, there's a section in the Edgar Filer Manual 6.7.29 to element name length. That applies specifically to extension elements and not to base taxonomy elements. And in the IFRS taxonomy, we did note there's a couple elements that have a longer name length than 200 bytes, but it doesn't apply because it's in a base taxonomy.
Okay, great. Thanks for that clarification. The next question that we had from a number of folks leading up to the call was, is there a semi-annual requirement for foreign private issuers?
Campbell, again, going to the original rule, it contemplates that the XBRL is required. Very sorry, people. The XBRL is required in an annual filing. There's no semi-annual requirement, but there may be additional filings other than the annual filing requiring XBRL, primarily in a Form 6K. And there's a number of reasons that a 6K would be filed that Jill is going to talk a little bit more about later. So that's how financials other than annual statements may be provided in XBRL and SEC filings.
Okay, thank you, Kimberly. Moving to the next slide, Michelle, and this just kind of gets into some of these details that Kimberly was talking about. So is XBRL required for all filings to the SEC besides the 20F? Do 6Ks and other filings require the use of the same taxonomy?
I could speak to that a little bit. I think Jill is going to go into a little bit more details about 6K. But again, the filings that require XBRL are specified in the original rule, and it does talk to the 20F and the 40F. So those are the primary filings. And then again, if there are 6Ks with certain types of financials in them, XBRL may be required. I'll let Jill cover that a little bit more because there's some ins and outs about that. But one comment I'd like to say is really the XBRL follows the actual requirements of the forms and the rules. So there's nothing specific about the XBRL necessarily.
Great. Okay, and I think we have some questions coming up, and Jill can answer those more specifically. So is there any filing requirement for registration statements of the S form types under IFRS?
Yeah, I think that this is probably a good way to talk about, I guess, the filing requirements a bit more broadly, as Kim had suggested. This is Jill Davis. In the rule, and then also if you look to item 601 of regulation SK, that's actually the item number that kind of drives and identifies when certain exhibits are required. In this case, it would be the 100, 101 series of exhibits. And that actually identifies certain scenarios of when the interactive data needs to be filed. Certainly as Kim has highlighted that you look to the form requirements, when you're filing a particular form. And then certainly if you go back to the rule, that actually provides a lot from 2009, that provides a lot of really interesting and important context while you're trying to wade through the different types of scenarios when interactive data would need to be filed. So for a company that's a new issuer, coming into our markets and filing an initial public offering either on a Securities Act 33 Act form or a 34 Act form, like a Form 10, interactive data is not required in those scenarios. And I'll just say generally, because I think depending on the timing of when a particular filing is made could change the fact pattern a little bit, but typically when a company comes in with an initial public offering, they will not have to provide interactive data at that point in time. But then when they start filing their first Exchange Act filings, that would be for a domestic company, you would expect it to be the first 10Q or first 10K. For a foreign private issuer, it would typically be the first 20F or the first 40F if they're filing under multi-jurisdictional disclosure system that's available for certain Canadian issuers. So at that point in time, they would need it. But then if they came into the markets again and wanted to file another registration statement, then that's where a lot of the 6K reporting requirements would come into play. So if a company comes in with a registration statement, they have an obligation to update their financial statements for certain specific scenarios that are outlined in this case in the Form 6K, as well as to some extent within the registration statement form. But say a company was filing all Exchange Act reports, they filed 20Fs every year, they didn't have any registration statements or even a shelf registration statement, they would simply file with their 20F the interactive data. But say they decided to file a registration statement, then they would need to look at the requirements that are outlined in Form 6K that would identify very specific fact patterns when a company would be required to include updated financial statements on a 6K that would then be incorporated by reference. Those circumstances include when a company has either had an error, they had to correct their financial statements, they would actually need to either do it through a 6K, they could also do it to an amendment to the 20F. Say that they've adopted an accounting principle in a new period subsequent to their financial statements, or they've had a discontinued operations. In certain circumstances, they would actually need to retroactively recast their financial statements. And one way of doing that is they wouldn't, in the latter two, they wouldn't amend the 20F, instead that they would actually put it on a 6K and then incorporate it into the registration statement. In another scenario, say that it's a 1231 company, the registration statement is going to go effective sometime in October. Since it's 9 months after year end, there's a reporting requirement under Item 8 of Form 20F that actually says they would have to provide updated financial statements, interim financial statements for at least 6 months period subsequent to the most recent year end. And in those cases, all those I described, interactive data would need to be provided with the 6K and then would also, through incorporation by reference, be included in the registration statement. So very long answer to a short question, but that's kind of the framework as I see it.
Great. Okay. No, that's very helpful. Hopefully that answers a lot of the questions that people had. So I think this next question has already been answered by your previous question. For quarterly filings, usually filed as a 6K, is it necessary to file EDGAR and XBRL? So the answer there is obviously it depends on all the circumstances you just mentioned.
Yeah, and I would like to highlight two areas that a company could look to. Last time we spoke at the last webinar, we talked about on the Division of Corporation Finance's website, we have compliance and disclosure interpretations. And there's one section that actually is specific to interactive data. And if they go to question number, I'm going to just spell, say what the number is. It's question number 146.13. That actually talks about the 6K scenario. But then if you look into the Form 6K itself, there's actually instructions, 5 and 6, that refer to XBRL-related documents as well as interactive data. Instruction 6 actually describes, very explicitly what what I talked about earlier, all those discrete circumstances where interactive data would be required to be provided. So hopefully, I think that should probably clarify a lot of questions.
All right, thank you. Okay, so the next question we had was, this is a complicated question, very specific. Does the grace period still apply for the first application of the IFRS taxonomy if a company previously submitted US GAAP taxonomies? Or does this grace period only apply to the first application of XBRL with regard to the accounting standard it relates to?
Campbell, the grace period only applies to the very first filing of XBRL by a discrete filer.
Got it. So even if you filed in US GAAP, previously switched to IFRS, now I'm filing an IFRS, you've used your grace period.
Correct.
The next question, and I think this may be answered, but just to clarify that, our consolidated annual statements are filed on a 6K about 45 days after year end, and this is followed by the filing of an annual information form AIF, on a form 40F. Are we allowed to file the form 6K without using XBRL and use XBRL for the form 40F filing?
Hi, Campbell. This is Jill. I'll take this question. It's actually a very interesting one. If you look at the instruction for Form 40F, and keep in mind that Form 40F it's one of these very specialized areas that's governed by it's called the multi-jurisdictional disclosure system. It's available to certain Canadian registrants that have, I think, a market cap of greater than 75,000 US, and they have their own. Just like you have the foreign private issuer forms, this set of foreign private issuers actually has its own discrete set of forms. And so in the instruction to Form 20F, General Instruction D3, it states that the annual report on this form or any attachments thereto shall be filed the same day that the information included therein is due to be filed with any Securities Commission or equivalent regulatory authority in Canada. So I think what this question is really getting back to is identifying certain timing differences between the time when a company has filed the Form 20F and then when the financial statements are actually, filed with a regulator and to the extent possibly furnished on a Form 6K. I would actually suggest that this is something that an issuer should write into the SEC to clarify the timing of when the interactive data is filed. There's a lot of questions that come about, and it gets into questions about the use of incorporation by reference. It gets into questions about determining whether something's furnished on a 6K versus filed. So I think that this would be an area where I think that we would work with DERA as well as our CorpFin's Office of International Finance and our Office of Chief Counsel to address the various elements of the question. So I would certainly encourage an issuer to write in, and they're welcome to contact me directly, and I could help them with that.
Okay, thanks, Jill. And then we had one other question, and I think we've covered this, but this is, should FPIs use XBRL for 6K filings as well? I think with the previous one of the previous answers, you pretty much covered this in general. Is there anything worth adding relative to 6K filings that people should be aware? You think people should be aware of?
No, there's nothing that really comes to mind. From my end, Kim, did you have anything else on that side?
No, not in particular, but as you said, I would encourage filers that may have unique facts and circumstances to contact the SEC with questions so that we can respond individually. And if we're seeing that there is, more wider based questions, that perhaps we could put out guidance in the future.
Okay, thanks, Kimberly. Thanks, Jill. So now we're going to move on to some questions on the taxonomy, and so anyone can jump in, but I think Andy will probably answer these the best. The naming convention, the first question was, the naming convention of the IFRS extended links differs from the FASB naming convention. Will there be any recommendations to have the naming conventions converge?
No.
Next question then. Andy, do you have anything to add to that?
Not particularly. I think I'll cover the wider explanation around that with the next question.
Okay, great. For those accustomed to using the US GAAP taxonomy, how is switching to the IFRS taxonomy going to differ?
Okay, so this actually covers quite a few questions that we got in that were a little bit more specific. What I'm going to do is share my screen again so that people can see the taxonomy. So I have the IFRS taxonomy. This is the 2016 taxonomy open on our IFRS website, which is where we host the structure of the taxonomy for general browsing. Now, there were a few related questions in this area. Basically, I gave a brief outline of and tour of the IFRS taxonomy in the previous webinar. In this one, I'm going to focus on a couple of specific differences that have been raised a number of times. So the first one of these relates to the structure of tables in the IFRS taxonomy. We've had a couple of comments from people who are looking for certain table features, including in particular table text blocks and also the top domain level of the default members in the top of the domain. Now, I've got a particular IFRS table open here, as you can see. You can see at the top that basically the main difference seems to be that we have a slightly different naming scheme. So you can see clearly here that for some items we use a similar naming scheme to the US GAAP taxonomy. So for example, a text block here is identified with text block in square brackets, but the structure of our tables is slightly different. So I'm just going to run through that briefly so that people can understand why it might appear that these items are missing. So, and we have here, you can see a text block at the top level. There's nothing above that within this note. And that text block here, as you can see, is disclosure of other provisions. This is the text block for the entire note. And you can see here it says the entire disclosure. Underneath that, however, we have another text block which says disclosure of other provisions. Now, this is where we usually put the table text blocks within the IFRS taxonomy. They appear outside the table. They do not specifically label themselves as associated with a table. However, you will notice that the text block usually has the same name as that in the table item below. There's then usually an abstract item. Again, that will have the same name. And you can see here we have the disclosure of other provisions. This refers to the whole, the table itself is the schedule disclosing information related to other provisions. And you can see there we have text block, abstract, table, axis. Within the axis, we then have the series of members. Unlike the US GAAP taxonomy, we do not specifically identify members as the domain member or the default member. However, you will notice that members are organized in a hierarchy, and this top level member here, in this case, other provisions, is the top member of this particular domain, and will be the default used within this axis. So if you're having difficulty looking through our taxonomy, finding specific XBRL constructs, then there's a reasonable chance that what you've identified is not necessarily that something is missing from the taxonomy, but that what we have done is we've used a slightly different naming scheme for that structure. Another thing that I wanted to raise that I think might be causing people some issues is related to the way that the IFRS taxonomy specifically refers to and describes IFRS reporting. Now, we know that there's been quite a lot of work recently with the with converged standards and with the boards working together. However, it's still the case that there are a number of differences between US GAAP reporting and IFRS reporting. If you are used to working with the US GAAP taxonomy, it may be that taking a concept that you are used to finding in that taxonomy or a specific axis that you find in that taxonomy and looking for it in the IFRS taxonomy does not necessarily produce the answer you're looking for. It's possible in some cases that we have used slightly different terminology. In other cases, it may be that there is a difference in the underlying accounting standards. So it is worth having a look, if you can, at some example statements for IFRS, some model statements. There are a number of those produced in the market. I'm not referring here to XBRL tagged statements. I'm just referring to examples of IFRS filing, which may help you identify if the reason that an item is not present in the taxonomy is because it is genuinely missing, or if it is because there is a difference in the way that that is disclosed between IFRS and US GAAP. Another brief note while I've got this open would be to just mention that we have a specific question on this later, but I'll just describe this now. That I think we use the term disclosure slightly differently. So for example here, this top text block is disclosure with other provisions, and we call it the entire disclosure, where disclosure here is singular and refers to the entire note. However, in other locations, we refer to disclosure of other provisions here and the disclosure of other provisions table. This does not necessarily mean that this text block is containing or designed to tag an entire note that also happens to match this text block here. It could be used to enclose a subset of disclosures that make up part of a note. So we use the term disclosure to mean both the whole note and any grouping or number of facts. A disclosure could, for example, be a single fact, as in the name of the entity-specific disclosure task force in XBRL. So when looking at these text box and looking at the name, the term disclosure here could be used flexibly to mean both circumstances. I think, yes, sorry, I was just getting a bit ahead of myself. I'll stop with that there and we'll go on to the next questions.
Yeah, so and the next question, and I think you've really answered this, was does the IFRS taxonomy have table text blocks? So, yeah.
Yes, and as I said, I suspected I would get a bit ahead of myself there, but yes, the answer is you will not, they are not called table text blocks. Searching the taxonomy for the term table text block will not necessarily find them, but if you go and look at the table in the link base, in the presentation link base, you will be able to identify text blocks associated with tables. In general, it's worth looking at these items in context, as both these types of properties are identified by position in the hierarchy.
Great, thank you. Thank you for that definition. That's really helpful. I know a lot of people had asked us the same question. Okay, and then questions are really around process related to taxonomy. How does the IASB handle new releases and taking feedback?
Okay, so I'll answer the first part of that. The IFRS taxonomy has, as I mentioned briefly last webinar, it has a different release process to the US GAAP taxonomy. The main thing to bear in mind is that the IFRS taxonomy has a number of public consultation periods, and they happen throughout the year. So we produce an IFRS annual taxonomy once a year in around March. The aim is for it to be released by the end of March each year. However, that annual taxonomy consists of a compilation of the updates that have taken place throughout the year. The number of updates throughout the year may vary. They are not specifically scheduled. The annual taxonomy has a schedule, but the updates do not. The updates are of three types. They may be results of the change in the standard or a new standard. This is similar to the ASUs produced by the FASB. They may be a result of what we call our common practice projects, which is the projects where we include extra commonly used reporting items in the taxonomy. This is often going to be a way that you will see industry-specific items introduced to the taxonomy. If you can't find an industry-specific item, it's worth listening to my comment earlier about checking what is commonly reported in IFRS and checking back for the standards. And the third type of release is related to potential technology changes. These are usually rarer, but they're where we, if necessary, we make changes to the XBRL structure itself. These releases, as I said, happen throughout the year. They have the public comment period. In general, that is normally a minimum of 60 days. It may vary for particularly small, what we might call a narrow scope amendment, and very large releases, such as, for example, the insurance standard, might well have a longer public consultation period to allow people time to properly review the items being proposed. Therefore, it's essential if you wish to comment on the IFRS taxonomy, that you pay attention to our release schedule. It will be available in the work plan on our website. And when a standard comes out that you are interested in, you can keep an eye out for the associated proposed IFRS taxonomy release, and then that is the point that it's possible to comment on changes to the IFRS taxonomy. When we release the annual taxonomy in March, that is a compilation only. Any comments at that stage, obviously, we will still have a look at them and we will pay attention to them. But at that point, any changes that we have made throughout the year will be final. And any comments then would have to go into, if we discover that there is an error in the taxonomy, they'd have to go into a future error release. The changes don't happen at the point we do the annual compilation. The other point about feedback that I wanted to make is, I mentioned briefly the Common Practice project. We are interested in feedback outside our public consultation periods. In particular, if people think there are items missing from the IFRS taxonomy as they start to tag their statements. The best way to provide this feedback is to email our group email address, which I believe is at the end of these slides, but I'll say it now anyway. It's taxonomy@ifrs.org. And if you can, it's best to provide us with some demonstrations or evidence of these items in use. In general, we try not to add things that might be considered entity-specific disclosures to the taxonomy, or disclosures that are overly regional. However, if there is evidence that something is missing from the taxonomy and is in common use and common practice, then if you can provide us with that evidence, it significantly speeds up the process of us assessing it for common practice inclusion.
Okay, great. Thank you, Andy. Okay, so I think everyone should be up to date on the cover, how to put comments in. Remember, don't leave it to the last minute when the taxonomy comes out. You need to follow the schedule. The next question we had is, when does the SEC plan to support the 2017 IFRS taxonomy, and will 2016 be supported for some time as well?
Hi, Campbell. This is Kim again. So the SEC usually doesn't talk about what and when it's going to do something in advance. But that said, the SEC does need to support the updated taxonomy so that filers can use updated accounting standards. And so sort of that's the goal of having taxonomies available. So what I would say is that filers should continue to monitor the SEC taxonomies page. And my assumption is that we will continue to support 2 IFRS taxonomies as we do with the US GAAP taxonomy. But the timing of that will be to be determined and announced later.
Thank you. So the next question we had relative to taxonomy was, the IFRS taxonomy has a number, this is a very specific question, has a number of items without a specified balance, a debit or credit balance. Is there any advice for working with these items, and is it acceptable to create extension elements with no balance type?
So the IFRS taxonomy, it does have a number of items without a specified balance. I believe that proportionally this may be a slightly larger number than the US GAAP taxonomy has. In general, we think that it should be reasonably easy for a preparer to know what the natural balance of that item is when it is reported. In general, the majority of the elements that we have that do not have a balance type specified, it's because they may appear in more than one location. And depending on that location, the sign with which they're reported might vary. So rather than give a balance type that might then conflict with the location of that reporting, we leave the balance type neutral so that a preparer may use the item in the relevant location regardless. There are a few other items with no balance type for other reasons. But in general, we expect most of these, I think, to be reported with positive values. Obviously, there will be some exceptions, but we don't anticipate it being too tricky to work out what the sign should be for those items without a balance type.
Okay, thank you. I think, Michelle, we're going to go to some CPE questions now.
Yes, that's right. Thank you, Campbell. Yeah, we're going to pull up a couple of CPE questions. These are the first 2, and so I'm asking my colleague to pull them up here. Just bear with me 1 second. Okay, the first poll question, which you should see on your screen, is the SEC notice on the IFRS taxonomy indicates that foreign private issuers must submit their first filing no later than And the selections are for their first annual report on Form 20F or 40F for fiscal period ending on or after December 15th, 2017, or for their first annual report on Form 20F or 40F for a fiscal period ending on or after December 15th, 2019, or immediately. So this is that foreign private issuers must submit their first filing no later than, and select one of these 3 times. So if you're getting CPE credit, please make sure that you respond, and we will record your response. And we'll give it just a few more seconds here. Okay, we close that poll down, and we're going to bring up our second poll question. When foreign private issuers begin filing an XBRL, do they have to file the XBRL at the same time as the HTML or text filing? Okay, and your choices are: the XBRL and HTML must be submitted simultaneously, the XBRL must be submitted as an exhibit after the HTML filing is submitted, or foreign private issuers can choose to file the XBRL document simultaneously or at a later date. So make one of those selections to record your answer, and then we'll close this poll down. Okay, and we will have 2 additional CPE questions at the end of the presentation. So if you're getting CPE, please make sure to stay on until the end in order to get your certificate. Okay, we're closing down now. Thanks very much. Okay, we're going to turn it back to Campbell and our presentation.
Okay, great. Thank you. We've got a few questions on tagging here, and so some of these may be pretty simple, quick answers. So first question is, does the SEC require issuers to provide a definition for each extension?
We do not. Rule 6.6.24 in the Edgar Filer Manual does require you to provide a definition under one specific circumstance, which is when you have items on the face financials and it's a custom element and it does not have a debit or credit balance. You have to provide something that disambiguates what the sign is supposed to be. Now, obviously, if you're going to be rolling the taxonomy over from period to period, it would be good practice to actually define what you mean by those custom elements. However, there is nothing in the filer manual other than that requires it.
Thank you, Walter. The next question, which I think has pretty much been answered, are extensions permitted in the IFRS taxonomy, or are they mandatory for using the SEC IFRS taxonomy?
Permitted, not mandatory.
Yeah. Is there a matrix that documents which form taxonomy combinations are valid? For example, IFRS only for 20F and 40F, 10K, US GAAP, etc.
Well, not yet, but at this point it wouldn't be terribly interesting because there really, at this point, aren't any restrictions on whether you can use one taxonomy or the other from a technical perspective. In other words, if you have an instance document and you traverse its DTS, its discoverable taxonomy set, and in that course of that, you arrive at the IFRS 2016 taxonomy and the US GAAP 2017 taxonomy, that is not for a 10K or a 20F either. Neither of those are going to be a problem. Obviously, if you're familiar with the rest of the SEC's XBRL reporting, there's a risk return summary. It's a mutual fund reporting document for which neither IFRS nor US GAAP is relevant, and so that's not allowed on those types of forms. But if there were going to be intentional restrictions on combinations of taxonomies, they would be documented in some fashion, possibly not in the filer manual itself, possibly as some sort of extension to a file which many of you will be familiar with, the Edgar Taxonomies XML file. So the exact mechanism by which we would publish and enforce that is to be determined. But at this point, there isn't any technical reason why you can't create a single instance of a 10K that uses both elements from IFRS and from US GAAP. it continues to be the case that you can't use US GAAP elements from 2 different years, right? So you can't use 2016 and 2017 together. So that sort of restriction will hold, and presumably some sort of restriction that would be derived from that. So you can't use IFRS 2018 with the US GAAP 2020. Something like that may exist. But once again, the point is that there isn't any published matrix because it's not really relevant at this particular moment in time during the voluntary period.
Thank you, Walter. The next question we had, if you're filing under both US GAAP and IFRS, is there any time savings that are available between the two taxonomies?
Now, here's the way I'm going to interpret this question. May or may not be the correct one. Let's suppose you're in Australia, you're filing under the voluntary ASIC program where you can file an XBRL filing with your annual lodgements of your statements, and you're using their IFRS taxonomy, and obviously with some number of elements in the instance document that essentially identify what the filing is to ASIC. So if you ASIC specific, I'm sorry, ASIC is the Australian securities regulator. So maybe a few ASIC specific elements. So the question is, I'm going to interpret the question as, can I just pick up what I've done there in Australia? Can I just attach it to my 20F and send it into Edgar? Well, almost. We wouldn't expect it to be terribly different, but because there are Edgar Filer Manual specific requirements, such as the thing called the central index key, right? So the central index key has to be used in a specific way inside the instance. There are restrictions on the instance. Also, Edgar, and once again, this may or may not be familiar to listeners on the call, Edgar allows you to use the IFRS elements just like it uses the US GAAP elements, and it allows you to use the US GAAP templates that were published with US GAAP 2017, but you can't import the entire wholesale documentation and references and all of the labels and all of the link bases. In fact, you can't import any of them. So you're really only using the elements from the IFRS taxonomy when you submit to Edgar. And so therefore, if what you sent into ASIC included references to files that Edgar doesn't allow, well, you have to do something different. So I think this is a long way of saying that yes, there's definitely potential savings because the choice of element is actually a significant part of the effort in tagging, right? And so that should not change. But in terms of the mechanism by which you actually package up a set of files and send them to Edgar versus sending them to ASIC, yes, we think that that is something which you're not going to be able to save much time on. But once again, the hard problem, remember that what you're doing here is you're actually doing a legal disclosure. Most of your time should be going into the correct selection of the elements and tagging the content and the substance of your filing. To the extent that there's some amount of machinery that has to work differently in ASIC versus the SEC, that's really unavoidable, and that would be duplicated effort.
Okay, thank you, Walter. The next question we had was related once again to these multiple taxonomies. The SEC standard taxonomies webpage allows for US GAAP elements to be imported and used with IFRS filings. What scenarios would this occur under, and what is the expectation of their frequency?
Well, this is a big subject. So, and I think we tried to answer this last time. It's somewhat early days, and we're allowing vendors and people who are looking at this from a filer's perspective to explore this. I believe that Kim and or Jill may want to follow up on this, but let's understand one very important thing. It is not our goal to duplicate a lot of elements and a lot of structure and between these two different taxonomies, and it's also not our goal to try and merge them into one gigantic taxonomy. Clearly, there are things which are common reporting concepts that between US GAAP and IFRS. And I'm not talking here about converged standards, right? That's not what I'm referring to. I'm just saying that there are things like legal entities and consolidation entities counterparties, related parties. These are very generic reporting concepts that arguably don't really belong in either US GAAP or IFRS. They might belong in some sort of common taxonomy. So I think, for the vendors on the call, I do want to alert you that this is something we're thinking about very seriously here. This would obviously be a change to the architecture to some degree in the US GAAP taxonomy. It would be something that would be available to the IFRS filers so that you make it much less likely that they would need to use any US GAAP elements. They might be able to refer to some other common taxonomy. And so it's early days, but I do want to alert the vendors that when you think about the alternative to doing that, in other words, having some common set of elements, they're all pretty ugly. And you want to think about what your software is going to do in terms of tagging, when in fact there's really, you don't just tag with an IFRS taxonomy. You may tag it with an IFRS taxonomy, some common reporting concepts, and the existing SEC DEI taxonomy, that there might be multiple namespaces that are needed in order to complete your tagging. And the same thing on the US GAAP side. It probably won't be the case forever that all of the things that are currently in the US GAAP namespace, in the US GAAP taxonomy, that are really generic to all sorts of reporting, they're probably not going to stay there forever. They're probably going to migrate out at some point. So you need to be thinking about how your software is going to manage a transition from using essentially only the US GAAP namespace and the DEI namespace for all of your tagging versus one where you're going to have to be a little more flexible and essentially choose elements from, if you will, a combined DTS that may involve multiple namespaces. So that's kind of the technical background here, and we're very, very interested in vendor feedback and ideas about this. Work on this idea has certainly begun already. But the basic question here, which is that what scenarios might require this, and what's the expectation of the frequency? It is my understanding, and I'll shut up in a moment and let Jill and Kim chime in. My understanding is that even when you file a 20F, and you're an F foreign private issuer, there are certain things that must appear in your 20F that would normally be US GAAP concepts, or maybe they're not really, they may not even be an accounting standard. They may be like SEC specific disclosure requirements. So to a first approximation, if you look in the US GAAP taxonomy and you find references where the only supporting reference for an element isn't in the codification, but rather is in SEC documentation like Regulation SX, to a first approximation, I believe those are the sorts of elements which might require using more than one taxonomy. So with that, let me just turn it back over to Jill and Kim, who are going to correct all the things that I just said which were wrong.
Hi, this is Kim. I could take a little bit more on that question. I think Walter's right at the end. Originally, we were thinking that, and we know that filers are required to comply with certain sections of Regulation SX related to particularly financial statement schedules, as well as certain potentially form requirements for financial statements in the Form 20F. So those elements are already contained in the US GAAP taxonomy, and their references are to the S99 section of the Accounting Standards Codification, which is the SEC section. So the intent was not to open up the US GAAP taxonomy for any element that might work. It's really to provide for something that is specific to the SEC disclosure requirements, and primarily those are the schedules and the form requirements. I don't know if Jill, you have something to add?
No, well, I agree entirely with what you said. And I think that there are a few kind of one-offs that might be coming from a particular form. And again, really take careful look at the form requirements. One thing that does come to mind would be companies that are in the oil and gas industry that file foreign private issuer forms. There's actually an additional requirement, I believe it's under item 18, there's an instruction there that actually specifically requires disclosures of supplemental oil and gas information. That would be, I think it would be under the U.S. codification, would be like ASC 932. But that would be kind of, I think, the exception to the rule. So there might be a few things that are specific to SX or a particular form requirement that may not be contemplated in the IFRS XBRL taxonomy, but I don't think it's that there's a whole lot of them. But it's certainly something that you would need to look at your form requirements and then use that as your starting point.
Thanks, Jill. So moving along, just in the interest of time, so the next question, I think we can answer these two together. Will there be 10K filings with IFRS references? If we just get a quick answer to that one.
Yeah, I can handle that quickly. There are a few companies that use IFRS, that apply IFRS, and they also file on domestic forms. Essentially, it's that if the XBRL or an interactive data that you file, that taxonomy that you use is going to follow the gap. So if you happen to be on a Form 10K or filing 10Qs, you would meet the requirements of the domestic forms, but then you would also use the IFRS taxonomy. But there's very few. There's not a lot that do that, but it is something that we see.
Okay. The next question is: will the structure of the XBRL exhibit be the IFRS XBRL exhibit be the same order as those under the US GAAP taxonomy? So, for example, financial statements, then level 1, 2, and 3 reports.
Yes, they are going to be the same. I'd like to answer a question that live that came in through the questions here, and it relates to sort of element selection. So here's the question posed: if you have an element in the IFRS taxonomy and the US GAAP taxonomy has the same concept, but one of them is more specific than the other, then one possible reading of the Edgar Filer manual is that you're supposed to go over to the other taxonomy, use the US GAAP element because it's the most specific. Well, no, I don't think that's really a correct reading. We certainly would like to look at those kinds of data type conflicts, but in general, should stand to reason that if you're doing an IFRS report, then you want to use the standard elements wherever possible. So the notion that you would go over to some other standard taxonomy probably is not what we want to do. I'd like to see more examples of this. So if you have, if the person who asked, the anonymous attendee who asked that, would like to provide more examples, those would be very interesting for us to look at.
Okay, thanks, Walter. Moving to the next set of questions, just on examples. I'll answer this question together. Are there any full examples of complete filing using the IFRS taxonomy? And secondly, have any companies voluntarily done test filings before the taxonomy has been approved? Is there a list of these filings for issuers?
No and no, or alternatively, not yet and not yet.
Thank you. For US GAAP filings with the SEC, we are required to use EN-US, English US. The IFRS taxonomy uses English, or EN. Can we use EN labels for our IFRS filings with the SEC?
Well, this is very much along the lines of the question that I answered online, which about the labels. It's not at all relevant, really. It's not relevant to Edgar what the syntax of the label link base in the IFRS taxonomy is, and the reason is because you can't actually attach that link base to your filing. You have to create your own labels anyway. Now that doesn't mean that the IFRS taxonomy labels don't mean anything. Obviously they do. There's a lot of meaning in there, but the fact that they happen to be a different EN versus EN-US, not at all relevant. You will still be using EN-US in your SEC filing.
Thank you, Walter. If we go to the next slide, and I think we answered this last time, will the SEC be using the formula link base in the IFRS taxonomy?
Well, once again, that's a cleverly phrased question about the future, which we can't answer. I will say that we have no plans at this time. On the other hand, I must say, that what we've been looking at from the XBRL US Data Quality Committee and the extent to which they have been able to create rules that are very effective at detecting certain kinds of data problems is very impressive. A lot of that can be encoded with the formula link base. So it's not really out of the question. As far as the formula link base specific to the IFRS taxonomy, we don't know. I guess I would encourage everybody to, who's doing filings, to take advantage of the fact that that very useful resource exists. Whether Edgar actually implements it upon validation, different question.
Okay, thank you, Walter. Moving to the next question, and this is a lot of text in this, but basically the gist of this question is there's specific EFM rules which refer to specific elements in the US GAAP taxonomy, and the question is, will the EFM be adapted to the IFRS taxonomy for these?
Well, there's a really evil thing that some people will do, which is, they'll write a paper, sort of a long paper, and then they'll put something really stupid right in the middle of it, just to see if you actually read it. Okay, well, this is not that, but in fact, last fall we did recognize that these three rules do refer to US GAAP specific members and axes and so on, that don't actually exist in IFRS. So we knew that this was kind of an issue. But if you think about what I said a few slides back, which is, look, there are some things that are actually common to all kinds of reporting, no matter what the accounting standard. This is probably a pretty good opportunity to actually merge those things together. And you should not be surprised if Rules 6 and 6 and 7 and 668, for example, are rewritten in such a way that they have a more generic usage pattern, or specific, or different elements, or different characterization of the elements, which for the short run, for a year or two, wouldn't require any change of tagging, but then in the long run would actually take advantage of the fact that there really is a sort of a common reporting model underneath things like consolidating instances, specific subsidiaries. This, once again, is something that the Data Quality Committee has done, I think, a very good job of analyzing in detail and figuring out exactly how consolidations and legal entities and how all that should be modeled. We're very impressed with it. The fact that it doesn't appear in the Edgar Filer manual yet doesn't mean that it never will.
Thank you. So I'm just going to ask the EFM question, and maybe we can, for time, go to the CPE questions. So just the final question on the EFM. So do all the rules of the EFM Chapter 6 apply for IFRS taxonomy? And if not, will the manual specify those that apply and those that do not?
It is our goal for the EFM Chapter 6 to make no distinction whatsoever between IFRS and US GAAP, in the same way that right now it makes no distinction at all between US GAAP and risk return.
Okay, thank you. So Michelle, why don't we, since we've got 2 minutes to go here, jump to the CPE questions?
Sure, thank you, Campbell. Yeah, we'll go ahead and bring up the third CPE question here. And you should be able to see it on your screen here. Unlike other publicly traded companies in the US, foreign private issuers were not required to begin filing in 2009 because you select one of the following. The IFRS taxonomy was not sufficiently developed. The Commission felt that foreign private issuers needed a longer grace period. Or 3, there was not a demand for interactive data files from foreign private issuers. So select the one that you think is most appropriate and submit it, and then we'll move on to our fourth and final CPE question. Okay, we're going to close the poll down now. Okay, and our last CPE question. The IFRS taxonomy will undergo a public review and comment period each year that will last for how long? usually a minimum of 30 days, usually a minimum of 60 days, or usually a minimum of 90 days. And again, please just click on the link that you think is most appropriate, or the button rather, and submit your response. And then once we've received responses after the session, we'll be able to send everyone their certificates within the next 2 weeks. And also, just for all of you, we have been recording this session, and we will send the replay out to everybody tomorrow, and it'll be posted up on our website. So we're going to close this poll in just a minute here. Oh, it's closed now. Okay, I'm going to turn it back over to Campbell.
Okay, so I just wanted to finish off. We have just some SEC reference links that obviously that we just show you on the slides here, but they'll be available that you can go and look at. This just probably answers some of the questions that have been raised today on the webinar. So there's both these SEC reference links, and this is both guidance on the 2009 rule and also Corp Fin guidance, and then there's also a list of IASB references. Obviously to the taxonomy, some folks had asked us for references to these on the last call, so we would make these available as well. So with that, it's the top of the hour. I'd like to thank all the speakers from the SEC, Jill, Walter, and Kimberly for joining us today and answering any questions we have. There are a couple of unanswered questions that we still had, not as many as last time on the list, but we'll get answers for those out as well. And I just want to let everyone know we're planning another IFRS event as well. We haven't put a specific time down, but for vendors. So if vendors have specific questions about IFRS implementation, we want to hopefully be able to address those issues as well that anyone has. So if you've got questions, if you're a vendor supporting IFRS filings, please let us know what questions you have, and we can put those forward for the next webinar that we do on that. So with that, thank you very much, everyone, for being on today's call. Thank you to the speakers.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.